everyone.
Good morning.
We finally get to talk about Palestine, and Israel and the land of the invaders. Now, I'm wondering if I should take this away. Done. And you can still hear me? All right. Well, let's see if this works as well. Doesn't look like it. That doesn't matter. We can do it this way. What we're looking at today isn't what's going on between Israel and Palestine at the present time. That's tragic. There are plenty of other people commenting on that, and that's not my intention to comment on today. Rather, we're going back in history, back to the time of the Judges. There was a time when Israel was ruled by people called Judges. And according to Judges chapter 14, verses 1 to 4, the Philistines had dominion over Israel, at least during part of that time. And it was Israel's time to choose, to make a decision. And one of the great people of the Bible, of course, is Joshua. And Joshua gave the people that he led into the promised land a choice. He made a very famous statement. He said, "Choose you this day whom you will serve. The gods which your fathers served, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."
Amen.
That's a great decision for all time, isn't it? Not just for way back then, many thousands of years ago, when the children of Israel had left Egypt and made their way into the promised land. A very roundabout way it was, because they had some competing ideas or views that they had to deal with. There were the people from the sea and the people from the land. Now, this may be new to you, and it may not. But the people from the sea represented something. They represented blasphemy and idolatry. And the choice they had to make was between those people and the humble worship of the true God. That was the choice that Joshua explained or gave to them. And it's the choice that has been, well, really a choice of all people throughout all of history. And that brings us right down to our time. But I'm going to go through a very quick recap of the people of the land, and then we'll talk about the people of the sea. Just to keep the sea mystery going, but I hope no one gets seasick over this. The people of Israel, the land. Well, the first we know of the pioneers of the Israelite people was when Abraham went from Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia, and he went to the place that God had found for him. He was followed, of course, by Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, and they settled this land. They were patriarchs of the Jewish people. They believed in one God, and that was a unique sort of an idea in those times. They had lots of gods. And then famine forced the Israelites to migrate to Egypt. And we know the story that they were there in Egypt for many years, went as free people, left as slaves. The Exodus took place around about the 13th century, that is 1300 years before the Christian era. And Moses led them out from Egypt. They went past Mount Sinai, they received the Ten Commandments, they received the law, or the Torah, as it's called. And they had 40 years of wandering in the desert. And eventually, in the 12th, 13th centuries before the time of Christ, the Israelites settled in the land. And they were ruled by judges immediately. They got a king later, but they were ruled by judges for a period of 350, nearly 400 years. The rule of the judges was quite long. And then about 1,000 years before the time of Christ, the Jewish monarchy was established, and Saul was appointed as the first king. Jerusalem was made the capital city 20 years later, and in 960 BC, we have the first temple was built by King Solomon. It became the national and spiritual centre of the Jewish people. But shortly after that, only 30 years after that, the kingdom was divided. The tribe of Judah stayed in Jerusalem, and 10 tribes, they went north and they had their capital at Samaria. Some years later, almost a couple of hundred years later, Israel, that is the 10 tribes, were crushed by the Assyrians, and they were exiled. And this left only Judah. And they were later conquered 6 centuries before Christ by Babylon. You might remember the story of Daniel and his companions being taken away to Babylon. The temple in Jerusalem, the one that Solomon had built, the first temple, it was destroyed, and most of the Jewish people were exiled. Following on from the Babylonians came the who? You know about the big statue of the man with the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron. Who came next after the Babylonians? Medes and Persians, that's right. And under the Persians, many Jews were allowed to return back to their homeland, and there they rebuilt the temple. Then a couple of hundred years later, along comes this fellow called Alexander the Great. And he introduced Greek culture, and the land was conquered by the Greeks. And a little later, after Alexander died, there came up 4 kingdoms. 4 kings followed him took over from Alexander. And one of the successors of those 4 was a guy called Antiochus IV. He was very significant in the history of the Jewish people. Sometimes he's known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes was not on his birth certificate. It was the name that he chose for himself when he was crowned king. And it means God manifest. This fellow, not only did he think he was king, he thought he was God. And he was a particular enemy of the Jewish people. He, in fact, made the Jewish ceremonies, the Jewish religion, illegal. So they were not allowed to practice their own religion in their own land. He replaced the altar to God in the temple with one to the pagan god Zeus. He offered sacrifices in there. Yes, imagine sacrificing a pig in the Jewish temple. That's what this fellow did. And if the Jewish people wanted to carry on with their ceremonies, they were imprisoned, and in some cases worse. No wonder the Jewish people refused to call him Epiphanes. Instead, they called him Epimanes, which means maniac. So it's a play on words, but in their language, maniac was somebody who was just a raving idiot. And the repression of the Jewish people by Antiochus IV led to what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And this was a revolt against those restrictions that had been put on the Jewish people and on Judaism. It's still celebrated today by the Jews with their Hanukkah ceremony. They remember what happened. That might seem to us, looking from here way back then, as a bit of a footnote in history, but it was a very big deal to the people at the time, and a very big deal still to the Jewish people. They got independence. So under the what's called the Hasmonean monarchy, and that's the family of Judas Maccabees. Judas Maccabees, nicknamed the Hammerer, and he hammered his way and rallied the people, and he led that revolt. And the Jewish people were free again. They ran their own affairs until 63 years before the time of Christ, when Jerusalem was captured by the Roman Emperor Pompey. And so began Roman rule, with Herod as a vassal king ruling over the land of Israel. The temple was refurbished. This was the time of the ministry of Jesus, from his baptism through to his death in 33. Another 33 years and there was a Jewish revolt against the Romans. They tried it again. This time they were not successful like they had been back in the Hasmonean times, and the temple was destroyed. Remember, Jesus had said that this temple would be thrown down and not one stone would be left standing upon another. And this literally happened when Titus, who was a Roman general, later became Roman emperor, destroyed the place. And there was a huge massacre. Then there was, in 73, 3 years later, the last stand of the Jews at Masada. You've probably heard about that. Masada being up on an elevated, very high mountain, and it was a fort or a fortress very close to where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This was followed by the Bar Kokhba uprising, and there was a fake Messiah called Simon. And they got, well, it didn't work. And from those times, from about the 4th century through to the 20th century, the Jerusalem was under foreign domination, dominated by the Turks, by the Muslims, by the Crusades, by the British after World War I, and through to the end of World War, or just after World War II, when the British withdrew from it and the United Nations recognised the current nation of Israel. So that's a very quick run through of the people of the land. What about the people of the sea? You can see on this map that Israel occupied the higher ground, the mountains, and the Philistines, or the people of Philistia, occupied the lower ground, the flat land, the plains. And this really goes right back to the time of Abraham and Lot, where Abraham and Lot's servants couldn't get on with each other, and a choice was given to Lot. What do you want, the mountains or the plains? He took the plains, and Israel took the mountains. Here we have a quote from Joshua, back to Joshua again. He's now in the promised land. He'd led them through the River Jordan. He'd led them into the land. And now he's an old man. Now Joshua, reading from Joshua chapter 13, was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, there remains yet very much land to possess. This is the land that yet remains. All the regions of the Philistines, it is counted as Canaanite. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines, those of Gaza, Ashdod, Askelon, Gath, and Ekron. And this raises the question, well, where did the name Palestine come from? And we find it's a very, very old name. According to the American School of Oriental Research, the Greek word Palestini was both a transliteration of a word used to describe the land of the Philistines, and at the same time a literal translation of the name Israel. The name Israel, of course, well, that's an English form of a Hebrew word, and the Greek form of it was Palestine. Most scholars believe the Roman Emperor Hadrian changed the provincial administrative name of Judea to Palestine to erase the Jewish presence in the land. So that's interesting. Originally, Palestine was Israel. The first reference to Palestine in the Bible is in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 10. It talks about Mizraim, he was a son of Ham. Remember the sons of Noah? Noah, who built the ark and survived the flood, and he had 3 sons. Remember the names? Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Yes. And Mizraim was a son of Ham, and he had sons of his own, one of whom was, if I can say this correctly, Casluhim, and from him came the name, or came the Philistines. So according to Genesis, the Philistines came from one of the grandsons of Ham. If we ask Josephus about it, Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived after the time of Christ. He was born about 30 years after Jesus. He was present in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. And he was with the Romans, not the Jews, and reporting on it for the Romans, even though he was a Jew. Interesting. But he says that Messaris, or however you'd say that name, had 8 sons, all of whom occupied the territory extending from Gaza to Egypt. But Philistinus is the only one whose country has preserved the founder's name, for the Greeks called this portion Palestine. So how did Palestine, or how did the Palestinians get there? There's another group of people that adopted the name of Palestine, and they invaded this territory in the 12th century, 1177 BC. That's a very busy diagram, but I want to simplify it a little by quoting from Amos chapter 9 and verse 7. Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Caphtor? Now Caphtor was Crete. That's the old name for Crete, as you can see there. And these sea peoples, I did tell you I'll explain who the sea peoples were. We're getting there. These sea peoples, they came from Crete. They were Europeans. And they settled in in place that is now called Palestine. Here's a bit of evidence of that. DNA from the remains of people who inhabited Ascalon fits a scenario in which seafaring populations from southern Europe fled collapsing Bronze Age societies more than 3,000 years ago and settled along the eastern Mediterranean coast, where they were dubbed Philistines. So we now know the origin of these people. This period, the 12th century before the Christian era, marks the collapse of what is known as the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. It was called the Bronze Age because the tools and weapons were predominantly made of brass. And then later, tools and weapons were predominantly made of iron. And if the Philistines had the knowledge of making iron weapons, this may be one of the reasons why they dominated the Israelites. Because this invading party, they came and actually dominated the Israelites during this period part of this period of the Judges. And throughout the books of Samuel, the Philistines are consistently a problem. You can see on this illustration where they had come from Cyprus and settled in this area. They had five main cities: Gaza, Ascalon, Gath, Ashdod, and Ekron. They were city kingdoms, hence the name Pentapolis, from the Greek word penti, meaning 5, and polis, meaning city. So there's these 5 city-states, and you can see they're very close proximity to Jerusalem. Ramesses III of Egypt, this is an extra-biblical source, refers to these same people. He said the foreign countries, the sea peoples, made a conspiracy. No land could stand before their arms. A camp was set up in one place at Amor. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which never came into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt. They laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting our plans will succeed. Well, that's in the 12th century. Come forward now to the 8th century. You know, when you're looking at BC or before the Christian era, you count backwards. And the lower the number, the closer you are to the time of Christ. Tiglath-Pileser, he was one of the famous Assyrian rulers. And he writes, as for Hanunu of the city of Gaza, who fled before my weapons and escaped to Egypt, I conquered the city of Gaza, his royal city, and I carried off his property and his goods. I fashioned a statue bearing images of the gods of my lords, and my royal image out of gold, erected it in the palace of the city of Gaza, and I reckoned it among the gods of their land. And so these dominant people became a bit less dominant as the centuries went by. In the book of Judges, chapter 10, we read that then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the people of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. They forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the people of Ammon. Remember, Joshua said, choose you this day whom you will serve. Unfortunately, many of them made a bad choice. Now, this is a very busy diagram, but what I want to do in the time that we have left is to really highlight three stories. There's a story of something that happened to the ark, that is the Ark of the Covenant, not Noah's Ark, but the Ark of God or the Ark of the Covenant. Something about Samuel, very strange character he was, and something about David and Goliath. Now, first of all, we have, we mentioned that the Philistines had conquered Israel. You can see Shiloh there on the right-hand side of the diagram. Does that do it? Yes, Shiloh. That was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept when they first settled in the land. This was before Solomon's temple was built, and the ark was kept at a place called Shiloh. Now the Philistines, they came in and they destroyed Shiloh. The leaders of the Jewish people got hold of the ark and they took it to a place called Ebenezer. At Ebenezer, it was captured by the Philistines. They took it to Ashdod, then to Gath, then to Ekron, and then finally they gave it back 7 years later. Let's explore this story. This is straight out of 1 Samuel chapter 5. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then they carried the ark to Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon. Dagon was a fish god. You can see he's a bit like not a mermaid, more like a mer god. When the people of Ashdod rose next day, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning, when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. The Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors. And when the people of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy on us and on Dagon our God. So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, what shall we do with the ark of God of Israel? And they all answered, have the ark of the God of Israel moved to Gath. Get rid of it, send it to someone else. Well, when it got to Gath, but after it had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, Gath, throwing it into a great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumours, so they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And as the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, they've brought the ark of God, the God of Israel, around to kill us and our people. So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of God, of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was very heavy on it. So just recapping, the ark had been kept at Shiloh. It was taken to Ebenezer. It got captured there. It went on a 7-year pilgrimage, first to Ashdod, where they'd done all sorts of things to the god there, Dagon, in the temple of Dagon. We'll mention that a little bit later, also in the story of Samson, because the temple of Dagon was the one that Samson destroyed when he after he was captured. They sent it to Gath. Gath said, "We don't want it." Sent it to Ekron. Ekron said, "Get rid of it," and went back to the Jewish people at Beersheba. Now the strange story of Samson. An angel, of course, announced Samson's birth when Israel was under the rule of and oppression of the Philistines. So the Philistines were in charge, and Samson's birth was announced. An angel foretold that Samson would deliver the Hebrews from the Philistines. It's almost echoes of the announcement of the birth of Jesus, when Jerusalem was under the rule of the Romans. He was the son of Manoah, born in the town of Zorah, of the tribe of Dan, on the border of Judah. And his home was near Beth-Shemesh, which means house of the sun. But Samson, it says here he went down to Timnah, which was a Philistine city, and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he told his father and mother, saying, "I've seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now get her for me as a wife." Then his father and mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among my people, that you must go and get a wife from the Philistines?" And Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Fancy using Samson to deliver the people. He's known as the strongest man, physically at least, who ever lived. His character weakness and his love for Philistine women, particularly Delilah, ultimately led to his downfall. He was the 15th judge of the succession of judges that ruled over Israel. And his reign as a judge spanned 20 years, estimated from 1554 to 1124, before the Christian era. And his life was marked by both extraordinary strength and very unorthodox methods. And unlike the other judges, he didn't lead an army. Instead, he single-handedly fought the Philistines in a very unorthodox way. For example, there's the story of him slaying a lion with his bare hands after he had offended groomsmen at his wedding to a Philistine woman. He massacred the Philistine army with a donkey's jawbone. And the cutting of his long hair would, of course, violate his Nazirite vow and nullify this ability. He was the last of the judges of the ancient Israelites mentioned in the book of Judges. And one of the last leaders who judged Israel, I think Samson was actually the last, Samuel rather, was the last before the institution of the monarchy. And there's another story about how he'd picked up the gates of the city of Gath and carried them off on his back. So he must have been a very strong man. And he was betrayed by his lover Delilah. This is not his wife, this is someone else. But Delilah was bribed by the Philistines to discover the source of his strength. After 3 failed attempts, he finally goaded Samson into telling her that his vigour was derived from his hair. And as he slept, Delilah cut Samson's hair, thereby enabling her to turn him over to the Philistines. A very, very strange story. And yet he is named in the book of Hebrews as one of the heroes of the Christian faith. He was born a Nazarite, was set apart with supernatural strength from God to do his work in Israel. He was ready to sacrifice himself so that his people's enemies might be overthrown. And he was willing to lay down his own life for the sake of his people. And again, that reminds us of somebody who came centuries later. Samson actually paved the way for Saul and David. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5, the situation with the Philistines was so bad that the people approached Samuel to appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Samuel did it, but he warned that there would be problems. One of the first kings, the first of course was Saul, the second was David. One of those, when he was a boy, David met up with one of the enemies, the arch enemies of the Philistines, Goliath. Remember the story? David and Goliath and the slingshot and so on, a great story. Here we have a few place IDs imposed over a photo of what it is like pretty much today. The valley of Elah, the place where Saul's camp was, the place where the battle was taking place. The story, of course, teaches bravery and courage and faith. We know that with immense faith, and it would have taken that, faith that God could protect him, David faced Goliath and came out victorious. And from Goliath's attitude, we learn that pride leads to a fall and to never underestimate your opponent. It's a lesson for Goliath. But did Daniel actually exist? For many years, critics of the Bible said, well, there's no evidence in non-biblical sources for even the existence of David, when he's presented as such a prominent person in the Old Testament story. Surely there must have been some traces of him left. And the archaeologists finally found something in 1993. The Tel Dan stela contains a Canaanite inscription which dates to the 9th century before the Christian era. And according to Wikipedia, it's possibly the most significant and only extra-biblical archaeological reference to the house of David. Well, it isn't. Back in 1886, the Mesha stela was discovered, and it had a reference in it that looked like it might be a reference to the house of David. And the Israelite people were being referred to as the house of David, which supports the idea that David was pretty important. And this 9th century King Mesha of Moab set up a stela in his capital Dibon. It chronicled his military victories over his enemies, including Israel and Judah, called the House of David. Problem was, from the 1860s, or 1880s rather, the inscription was defaced, and you couldn't be sure that was what it said. It looked like it was saying that. It looked like a reference to the house of David, but you couldn't be sure of it. Now, as time has gone by, methods of examining these sorts of things from the past have improved, And in 2015, using modern X-ray techniques, they were able to confirm that indeed it did say House of David. So it's great to have evidence outside of the Bible confirming the Bible story. Coming back to the ark, I said I'd give you three stories. There's the ark, there's Samson, and David and Goliath. Well, coming back to the first of those, the ark, it remained at that place right there after it had been returned. It was still there 20 years later. And then along came Samuel. And Samuel said, if you return to the Lord with all your hearts and put away the foreign gods from among you and prepare your hearts and serve him only, he will deliver you from the Philistines. So Israel served the Lord. They finally made a good choice. Choose ye this day. Now Samuel is giving them a choice. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and drove them back. Finally, they had a victory. Then Samuel took up a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen and called its name Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. So what is the significance of Ebenezer? It serves as a reminder of God's intervention and assistance. And that came when the people decided, yes, we will serve the Lord. Just as Joshua all those years earlier said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Finally, under Samuel, they said, we will serve the Lord. It symbolizes the moments when God stepped in to help his people overcome challenges. And just as Samuel set up the stone of remembrance, we too can reflect on our own Ebenezers, the times when God has been our refuge and strength. Can you think of some times in your life where relying on God has been a strength for you? Maybe you're hoping and praying for that for the future, because we all face challenges and uncertainties. We can get some pretty bad news, medically or otherwise, at any moment. And we can be forced in our minds to rely upon the strength that only God can give. And in our 21st century lives, I think it's good if we could recognise our own Ebenezers. Acknowledge God's faithfulness and grace for what he's done for us in the past, and rely upon him in faith upon what he will do for us in the future.
Amen.
And isn't that the great choice to make? That's the choice we all face. May God bless you all.